Hello everyone, and it's once again time for a one-off video in between retrospective series. And for this one, I decided to go a little off base and touch on something which I find myself doing more and more in my spare time these days, and that's playing a little bit of Diablo 2. Now, Diablo 2 is quite old as of now. It's the first video game I remember playing, in fact, and I think it was released in 2000 or 2001. It was the sequel to Blizzard's original blockbuster, Diablo 1, itself a masterpiece, and the game is a legend and one deserving of that title. It's survived unto this day as a high point of the RPG, or at least action RPG, pantheon, and it's a very fun and unique game full of variety and innovative game decisions. At least for the time. We do have to note it's over 20 years old at this point, but with a feeling all of its own, I just felt like taking a closer look at it and answering the question in the title/thumbnail. That being, is Diablo 2 the best RPG of all time? First though, we must learn how to control and interact in the game. It's a pretty simple scheme. Move by clicking the mouse where you want to go, and attack an enemy by hovering the mouse over them and either left or right clicking. Different skills can be assigned to the left or right clicker, ensuring that you have a variety of options. For even more variety, skills can be assigned a hotkey, which are the buttons F1 through F8, to be swapped through quickly by pressing either that F button assigned to it or using the mouse wheel. Pretty simple, but pretty effective. Additional helpful controls including holding shift if you want to use a left click attack without moving, and holding the alt key to see all the loot lying about. Now this game is kinda old, so be aware that there's also some jank in here from time to time. It isn't always easiest to see the projectiles, and sometimes the characters just have some brain farts. As for collision detection, it's not always the best and can be very helpful or dangerous to you at times. It can be helpful in that the enemies have the same issues and at times can get stuck either walking into each other or a wall, or literally stuck inside of a wall, making them easy targets, and it can also hurt you where if you hit a door frame or don't necessarily click in the exact right place, you might end up getting surrounded and mobbed with no way out. Although, if you get mobbed, maybe you were playing a little too belligerently. None of this is an issue 98.5% of the time, I just felt like I should mention it, as the game is old and on occasion this shows, as it can cause some of what I will refer to from now as BS deaths. Knowing all this though, let's get to questing. Now, in order to start our quest, we'll need to create a hero to quest with. And this brings us to the character creation screen. Now the original game had 5 classes, and the later Lord of Destruction expansion added 2 more, the Assassin and Druid. More on those later. For this video though, we will be sticking to the core cast of 5 heroes, and we will assign each hero their own chapter in the game. Now when you make a character, you play as that character throughout all the chapters and difficulties, so I will say that this isn't necessarily the most quote accurate playthrough, as it's actually a combination of 5 different playthroughs, though I chose to take this method in order to get a good look at the core cast, and in accord with official lore. As in official lore, it was one party of 5 heroes, I believe. Do note though, however, this means that sometimes characters will be doing chapters they've already completed. For example, Morticia, the Sorceress of Chapter 2, completed 80% of Chapter 2 before coming back to get footage for this. I used some characters that were already lying about, as I didn't want to have to do 5 independent playthroughs on different difficulties to show you a good feeling of the game. So in the interest of time saving, some characters are redoing quests they've already completed. This doesn't affect the gameplay at all, and it doesn't really affect what shows up on the screen. It only affects some cosmetic stuff and abilities of the players to go somewhere. For example, Morticia has all the Act 2 waypoint markers unlocked because she's completed most of Act 2 before this was made, although all the quest bosses respawn, so you can easily go back and basically recreate almost every quest. The only difference being is that certain quest items won't drop, and the quests are already marked as complete. This is another design decision of Diablo 2 I actually really like, is that you can basically recreate and redo most quests if you want to grind for loot or items, and that bosses always come back for a good round 2 should you want to have one. It also makes it much easier to get footage for a YouTube video that you put together in about a week. Anyways, for the first chapter, we'll be choosing a Barbarian, and as this class is what I feel the simplest and a good gateway into the game. Now this is Jimbo with a Barbarian, and right off the bat, let's discuss some core elements of the game before we dive in completely. First off, each character has statistics in Strength, Dexterity, Vitality, and Energy. Strength affects weapon damage and what kind of gear you can equip. Dexterity also serves as a gatekeeping stat and affects chance to hit with melee attacks and block melee attacks if you have a shield equipped. Vitality is how much life you have, and Energy determines mana pool and mana regain. Below these are elemental resistances, and the 4 elements in this game are Cold, Fire, Lightning, and Poison. Each does different damages and has some unique quirks to them, which we'll talk about more later. Just remember, high resistance good. Finally, before we begin, Let's just mention the skill tree mechanic. Every time your hero levels up, they get 1 skill point to invest in any of the skills that they've unlocked on the skill tree. Each skill tree has 3 tabs depending on what class you're using, and each tab kind of classifies like skills. Most skills require that you A. reach a certain point, B. have at least 1 skill point in the skill prior to it, and C. have a free skill point. Note that extra skill points in prerequisites tend to buff later skills in some way, although this isn't a concrete norm, so investing in previous skills can sometimes help in later skills, even if you don't use that previous skill. There's no concrete way to invest your skills, although there are many different recommended builds for different classes, and some skills are objectively better than others, so do note that. Finally, let's look at the kit that will start your quest, which is pretty basic. As time progresses though, you will get much better stuff, and once you start collecting charms, inventory space will be at a premium. You have equipment slots for headgear, armor, a weapon, a shield, or offhand, belt, gloves, 2 rings, boots, an amulet, and your partner, which we'll talk more about later, also has equip slots for them. The first item to fill these spots will probably just be basic items with no real properties, these are notated with white text, but will soon transform into magical blue items, which each have one of a litany of positive powers. If an item has more than a few blue properties, it will be a yellow item, which is considered rare and even better. Above yellow items, there are green items, set items, which, although only having a couple buffs when used alone, can unlock very unique and powerful buffs when used together, and gold items, which have a unique look, name, and usually very unique power. These are, I think, the rarest and quite powerful when you do find them. In addition, there are gray items, which either have sockets to put gems, jewels, and runes into, which can make quite powerful items if used well, or gray text can also denote an ethereal item, which is pretty much trash as you can't repair them. Let's get to questing though. Now, the structure of Diablo 2 is pretty simple. You fight a guy, or you fight a bunch of guys, or you fight some guys to get to another guy who may or may not be the guy you fight for another quest. It's pretty simple, but it works pretty well. There's a lot of quests in this game, although the only ones which are really essential are the ones which require you to kill the act bosses, and the quests that killing the act bosses require, i.e. the quest you need to complete to get to the act boss. Really, you don't need to do a majority of the quests in this game, although each one does offer unique rewards, so it is recommended, if for nothing else, to rewards and experience gathered along the way. One other thing to note right before we start, you press the tab button here, boom, get a nice little map. This map is cool, it'll show you where you are, it'll show the general layout of the land, and since it overlays the screen itself, it's pretty easy to navigate. Different X's of different colors can signify different things. You're the dark blue X, partners are light blue X's, portals are yellow X's, white X's are NPCs, and I believe sometimes bosses, like act bosses, will show up as red or pink X's. With the basics out of the way, let's get on to the main quest. Now this is the Barbarian. This is Jimbo. He's a pretty simple guy. He's strong, he wants to hit stuff. His primary attribute is strength, and he can brute force a lot of stuff. That's kind of the Barbarian's way of solving problems. He's honorable, and simply wants to beat the crap out of evil. Pretty cool dude who finds himself the focal point of Chapter 1. Now Act 1, or Chapter 1, I will be using those terms interchangeably, is set in the lands adjacent to the Rogue Monastery, a reference to the Rogue class of Diablo 1. It's a land of grassland, marshes, and occasional buildings, and the plot here is that Jimbo, and the other heroes for that matter, need to get to Diablo, the guy on the cover of the box, and that requires passing through this mountain pass, which is guarded by the Rogue Monastery, which has been overrun by evil. Now in order to do this, Jimbo must help the rogues clear out the monastery and the surrounding lands. He will do this starting with the Den of Evil, as requested by the rogue leader Akara, and proceed on from there. Now, this quest is pretty easy. You go to the cave, you eliminate the evil from the cave, you dink around a bit, boom, profit. And again, this boils down to how most quests in the game work. Either you end a dude, you end a bunch of dudes, or you end the dude, the guy in charge of the act. Now, I'm not saying this is bad, I'm just noting it. I like the simple structure, and again, most quests gives a reward. For this reward, Akara will give you a skill point, and the ability to reset skill point allocation should you decide to come back to her later. But the skill point leads us to the skill tree of the Barbarian. Now, one of the reasons I thought it best to start with the Barbarian is that, for better and worse, his skill tree is pretty self-explanatory. His 3 tabs are War Cries, Combat Masteries, and Combat Skills. War Cries see the Barbarian shout, and this in turn, depending on what is shouted, grants certain buffs to the Barb and his party. This tab also includes the ability to find items in the Find Item sub-branch of the skill tree, which is Find Item, Find Potion, and Grim Totem. Now, these skills in and of themselves are not the most handy, but they do serve as corpse disposal, more on that unique utility later, and do help acquire loot, so I'd recommend putting a point in at least Find Potion for the corpse reasons. The next tab is Combat Masteries, which includes 6 mastery skills, 2 skills pertaining to movement, and 2 skills pertaining to defense. The mastery skills are all significant buffs to damage done by a weapon of a certain class, but effectively useless if a weapon of a different class is used. This means that a barbarian that puts a lot of points into a certain mastery is potentially locked out of using certain classes of items, and this can impact variety later on, though you are granted a few skill resets, so you are able to retool should you need to. The walking skills boost max stamina and stamina regain, kind of useless, but also movement speed, which is definitely not useless. Defensive skills like Iron Skin and Natural Resistance help you tank all the harder, always nice. Finally, the Combat Skills tab are the flashiest of the Barbarians tabs, and this means getting stuff done. It is here that the Barbarian can use useful moves like stunning enemies, jumping real high and attacking at the same time, turning into a helicopter, and simply going ham. These skills are all kind of flashy and pretty cool, and combined with some nice passive buffs from other tabs and war cries, can make the Barbarian quite fearsome indeed. With all of this explained, let's get back to the quest. Now, a lot of Diablo 2 simply spent questing, that is, walking around, beating stuff up, and exploring the natural worlds of Diablo 2. It's a very easy game to get lost in, as it is quite atmospheric, and most of the lands are quite different. While you go through a lot of plains in Act 1, they're all slightly different. The Stony Plains has, well, big rocks. The Tree of Inefis is located in the Dark Wood, the woods. The Black Marsh is noticeably swampy, and this trend of slightly different but still unique areas of different acts continues all throughout the game. Now, in Act 4 especially, there's very big differences between certain areas, and Act 3 is more punctuated of jungle versus abandoned town, although all the areas are still unique, and it does feel like you're truly progressing whenever you explore in Diablo 2. It feels like you're coming into a new area, and you're clearing it, which is a very nice design decision. It also means that there's plenty of time to do this. Insert combat footage. Anyways, back to the questing, and here out in the fields, we've come across this cool little square. Now this square is a waypoint marker, a handy friend which lets us teleport between other waypoint markers, towns, and even acts. Before we had access to this, all we had to use was a very convenient, but not free, Scrolls of Town portal. Very important items, by the way. Anyways, waypoint markers let us stop for a while and listen to other things, and even exit the game, and they serve as nice progress markers, as while town portals do not last should you close out the game, waypoint markers will always be there as long as you've touched it before. The reason we're in this field, though, is because of our next quest, which is assigned by Lady-at-Arms Kasha, who wants us to go out and put down an old corrupted friend. That is Blod Raven. Now, all this requires is paying her a visit, ignoring the goons, and done. Go back to town to talk to Kasha, and see what reward lies await. Now Kasha rewards us by assigning us a partner, and this leads to talk of the partner mechanics of the game. Now the world of Diablo 2 can be a bit lonely, and sometimes it's nice to have a bit more damage and company to get by. To remedy this, you can get a partner. Now before the expansion Lord of Destruction was made, each partner was locked into an act, so you could experience every partner in one playthrough, which you still can now, but it also meant that partners were kind of useless, as even if they did grow, you wouldn't be able to use them past the previous act, so they were kind of more temporary help. With the Lord of Destruction expansion though, partners travel with you throughout all acts and can become a solid member of the cast. World 1 has a rogue, an archer, World 2 is a paladin, arguably the best partner, World 3 is a sad mage, and World 5 is a barbarian. There's none for World 4. Now each partner comes with one baked-in skill or spell, and their own stats and gear slots. Often, if you find something nice, but can't use, see if your partner can. It might help them a lot. They'll put it to good use. Do note, though, that partners also have life bars, and while you can give them potions, their II and inability to get out of tough areas, or doors, can mean that sometimes they get especially easily killed, especially when fighting an act boss, against whom they do reduce damage. Fret not, though, as the power of gold and perseverance can bring them back. Now that Claudia has joined the party, let's continue. For the next quest, we have been assigned to retrieve Deckard Cain, the Deckard Cain from Diablo 1, Old Man Extraordinaire, and he's currently being held prisoner in the ruins of Tristram. Now, what this means is that we gotta get to Tristram, which requires that we find some rocks, touch a tree, have Ankara read the bark of the tree, and then that tree bark will tell us how to touch the previously mentioned rocks, in order to get to a town that is probably at least miles away. Very simple undertaking. Oh, and also along the way I found this book that told me to go get the Countess. More on that later. Anyways, once we get the tree bark, after going through a cave and beating up some yetis, we can now rescue Deckard Cain from the first game, fight Griswold from the first game, and steal Wirt's leg from the first game. Now, alongside our partner, Deckard Cain is probably the only consistent member of the cast and will be a great help. You see, he can identify items for free, and all of them at once. Before this, every time you picked up a magical item, you'd have to manually identify it using a scroll of identity, in a very tedious process. It sucks, honestly, and I'm glad they introduced Cain early, as they probably realized how much the scroll mechanics sucked, and they also probably realized how most of the quests in this game aren't really necessary. They combined two birds and hit it with the same stone. They made an unnecessary quest rewarding by giving this great free identity mechanic, and this free identity mechanic also eliminated the tedium of having to buy a scroll of identity every time you wanted to read the fine print on the box of, say, a magical mace. Deckard Cain's also just a pretty cool guy. He serves as the patented wise old man of the group and loves to talk. He's great for filling out lore, and, you know, it is fun sometimes just staying a while and listening. Back to the Countess, though. As prescribed by this old book found in the middle of nowhere, this quest can be missed pretty easily, but it is pretty cool. Basically, you read a book from some time written by someone, and then you go into her literal dungeon, steal all of her stuff, and then return her to the primordial ooze for being an objectively bad person. All we gotta do is go down the 6 levels of this here dungeon, defeat a bunch of bad guys and a couple uniques along the way. I think there's one unique per level. And then you get to the Countess, you take her stuff, and then she usually drops some gems. And this brings us to loot talk. Like all RPGs, grinding can be a thing in Diablo 2 should you want to. Although, unlike some other RPGs, I feel like Diablo 2 never really forces you to grind should you explore thoroughly and do all the quests. Though grinding for levels is usually not nearly as effective in this game as grinding for loot. You see, some items, especially gold ones, in this game can be quite broken. And having great gear will always get you further than having crap gear. While you can buy some cool stuff too, just note that usually the best stuff requires you getting your hands dirty. If you find something really cool though, that you can't use at the moment because you don't meet the stats required or the level required, or it's an excessive amount, like say you have an excessive amount of gems or runes, or you're just some kind of hoarder like me, fret not, as this doesn't necessarily need to be in your inventory, as you can simply keep them in your own personal stash. Now the stash is great, as it goes with you to each town you visit, and it keeps your stuff safe and out of the way as you adventure. You can keep whatever you want in here as long as it fits in the inventory available. Importantly, you can also store a metric ton of gold in it, which is very nice as you lose the gold on your person should you die. Constant deposits ensure that your money is always safe and that you don't need to withdraw either, as money will automatically be taken out should a purchase surpass what's on your person. This mechanic is also a good example of Diablo going out of its way to simplify and streamline some processes which could otherwise be annoying. It simultaneously offers a solution to the problem of losing money upon death, and makes it to where it's convenient and easy enough to use, where the realistic logistical issues don't bog it down. I.e., it's not really realistic, you can use it like a credit card. They didn't have electricity back then, at least non-magical electricity. But it's very nice quality of life knowing that I don't have to withdraw to repair my mace should I be 2 gold short. Speaking of repairs, our next quest is assigned by the Blacksmith, Charcy, who just wants her special hammer back from the Rogue Monastery. But before we do that, it's time for the first installation of a segment that I thought I'd pepper throughout the series to get to know some of the NPCs and towns of Diablo 2, and that is Merchant Spotlight. You see, most of Diablo 2's NPCs are merchants, and they come in a few different archetypes. Each merchant kind of deals in different things, and each act usually has a different thing merchant. As noted earlier, waypoint markers let you go between acts, so if for some reason you want to see a certain merchant, that's always available as long as you've already seen them before in this current difficulty. And the first archetype that we're going to look at is the Blacksmith. Now every town has and needs a blacksmith to repair your gear, and while you can also buy from them, the primary service that they render will be repairs. Now durability is a mechanic in Diablo 2, but unless you have ethereal items, it doesn't really impact anything. If an item's durability reaches 0, it will not be usable, but it won't break. That is, it won't disappear from the game. You'll still be able to use it once it gets repaired. Now repairs, of course, for this reason are quite handy, and it is for this reason that the Blacksmith will be someone who you will often visit quite often. You just go to them, you press the handy repair all equipped item, or button, and all your equipped items will be nice and new. This durability mechanic is one of the small flavor mechanics the game has, but I don't mind it because unless the item is extremely expensive to repair, and yes, those do exist, it's not really a hassle. Most repairs are pretty cheap in my experiences, unless it's a gold item that for some reason breaks constantly. However, the Blacksmith is also something which I think is pretty cool, as it gives an identity to an NPC, which this game is surprisingly good at doing. Charcy here is a friendly barbarian blacksmith, and like most blacksmiths will sell physically oriented gear. She'll sell you shields, armor, and melee type weapons, which is usually what blacksmiths tend to sell. All around, pretty cool merchant. Having gotten the smiths and Charcy's hammer back, it's time to end this occupation. Though before we do, I'd just like to note a few quirks of the Barbarian. Now, the Barbarian is the only class that can dual wield most weapons. I think the Assassin can do it with claws. And many of his skills are actually based upon this. While this of course lowers his defenses, it also means he can hit like a truck. And you don't really need to defend against someone if you've already killed them. His unique items go along with this, as his mighty weapons and horned helmets cater to strength and brute force. Strength, of course, is unsurprisingly his core stat, and it boosts his damage done, although since he's going to be very physical, I'd also recommend some stats in vitality. Boy's going to get hit a lot if he does a lot of hitting. The Barbarian, though, is also surprisingly varied in terms of his utility skills. As mentioned earlier, he has a corpse disposal skill, and he has some great mobility options like Whirlwind, which lets you cleave physically through enemies, overcoming that collision issue I mentioned earlier, and Leap, which is another great get-off-me option and can help you get out of some tough jams, especially since it lets you leap over physical obstacles, like say rivers. Again, while the Barbarian is a simple man, simple isn't bad, and in fact, simple often gets the job done. And now, Jimbo's gonna get the job done as he goes on to the final act, or the final quest of this act, and the final boss. Now, to get there, we have to go through the Tomo Highlands, explore the monastery, go to church, go to jail, go to more monastery, which is somehow inside a different monastery. I guess we went through like a U-tunnel, we went down, then we came back up. Then we gotta go down some more stuff, gotta go through some basements. We are now on level 4 of the catacombs. And it is here where resides the very family-unfriendly Andariel. Now, quick comment, Diablo 2 is a very old game, and it's rated M for a reason. A lot of the female designs are a bit gratuitous to my personal dislike. Again, I don't really see the need for any of this, but I'm not a game designer, I'm not a salesman, so I don't know. Not really going to say more, although do note, I like keeping my stuff family friendly, so we'll be using this black box to keep things PG. Andariel's gimmick, though, is that she's a very toxic woman, and will try to poison you to death. This poison works quite fast, though. Although, again, since it is poison-based damage, it hits over time. That's kind of the gimmick of poison. It does a ton of damage, although this damage comes in installed payments as opposed to one lump sum. This makes it manageable as long as you're quick with potions or town portals, you cannot die in town and can get free healing there, and eventually Jimbo prevails through brute force and simple planning. Now, Andariel goes out in a blaze of glory, you steal her stuff, and now the monastery gates are open for you to get to Chapter 2. Now this brings us to Act 2, and for this act, we'll be using the Sorceress Morticia here. Now the Sorceress is a master of elemental magic, and it's up to her to clear the deserts of Lukalane and continue our trek east to meet the prime evil, the guy on the box. Now the Sorceress is basically the exact opposite of the Barbarian. She's very cerebral and near completely ranged, a glass cannon who uses her powers to attack from a distance. Her primary stat is energy, and while the Barbarian didn't use too much of that, the Sorceress is near completely dependent upon it. And this dependence will have to get her through to the east as she arrives in the city of Lukalane. Now this is a prosperous trade hub, although it's in a really bad way right now, as recent happenings have led the city's leader Jaren to closing the city off to all travel for the time being. Topical. To remedy this, we must clean up the surrounding lands, and this entails, you guessed it, beating up some evil stuff, getting some old stuff, using old stuff to combine into other stuff, and then beating up more evil stuff. Again, I love the simplicity of this game. To start, we gotta clean up the city itself though, and that means crawling through the sewers and avenging Atma's husband. This means visiting Radamant in the gross sewers, and acquiring a book of skill and a piece of paper, telling us to make a Horadric staff to visit Tal Rasha. More on that later. Focusing on the book though for the moment, this grants us a skill point and leads us to the Sorceress skills. Now the Sorceress, like all others, has 3 different skill tabs, and her shtick is that each tab is assigned to a different element, one for fire, one for lightning, and one for cold. Each of these tabs has a primary projectile or bolt attack, a corresponding area of effect attack, a passive mastery buff to boost everything in that tab, and a line on the right which buffs either defense, attack, or mobility. To start, there are the cold spells, which deal cold damage. Cold spells, and cold magic in general, deal the least overall damage of all the elements, but provide the noticeably practical effect of slowing enemies down and can literally ice opponents, turning them into ice cubes and serving as good corpse disposal. Again, while cold may not do the most damage, it is actually very handy, as slowing a horde of enemies down and picking them off eventually is a lot better than hitting a few for a lot of damage and then getting mobbed by the ones that survived. In addition, the Cold tab also includes the Ice Armor line, which consists of 3 slightly different shielding spells, which can all make you noticeably less frail. Next is the Lightning tab, which, again, has a standard projectile and area of effect spell, but also includes Lightning Mastery and some mobility spells. These mobility spells are Telekinesis, kind of mid, and Teleport, which is very unmid. This allows you to zip across the screen, eluding harm, crossing rivers, doing whatever, kind of just trolling everyone. Great skill. It can be very helpful and important. The Lightning line also includes Energy Shield, which lets your mana absorb damage in place of your health. Again, since you're very mana dependent, I don't know if this is the best skill, but I'd rather have no mana than no life points. As for the damaging spells, lightning spells should be noted for their inconsistency. They often move fast, like lightning, but they deal the widest variance in damage. As you can see, the base damage for all lightning spells is set at 1, and some other very high number. Sometimes a lightning spell will hit for instant fried monster. Sometimes it won't. And this brings us to the Fire tab. Standard Bolt? Check. Area of Effect spell? Check. Damage? Higher than cold, more consistent than lightning, no flashy effects? Check. Buffs to attack? Check. And this is where it gets interesting. Now the Fire skill tab is the one which buffs the attack stats, and this is where it gets weird. Warmth is the first of these skills and boosts mana regeneration significantly, and it's passive, which is great. That's all it does, but for a sorceress, this is an essential skill. Put 1 or 2 points into it, at least. Next is Enchant, and this spell is probably her most unique spell. What Enchant does is enchant your weapon to make it more likely to hit and deal additional fire damage. It can deal quite a bit of damage, but this also requires you to hit a monster, up close. As a ranged character, known for being frail, multiple times. I think you see where the issue is here, although I have heard the skill is useful in certain builds centered completely upon it. Finally, the last attack buffing skill straight up just creates a thing to do damage for you, and that is the Hydra, which summons a fire-spitting Hydra. Overall, the Sorcerer skill tree is pretty cool, and there's a lot of options here, but I would advise you to do one thing if you make a Sorceress, and that is you have to invest in at least 2 different elements, as if you fight a group of monsters immune to your primary element, it's nice to have a secondary elemental tab to switch over to, and different skills to utilize, as opposed to just dying. On the topic of options, we talked to Cain again, and now the old man says we need some help to progress. Having read the piece of paper we found in the gross sewers, he determines that help can only be granted by the Horadric Cube. Now this cube is obtained by clearing out a tomb system deep in the desert, and requisitioning it. These guys aren't using it. I mean, I'm sure we can borrow it for a bit. Cain doesn't mind however we got it though, and instead he just goes on to explain the most important item in the game. You see, the cube isn't just some dinky, 3-dimensional square-like structure. It's not just a quest item either. No, it's so much more. First off, the cube can transmute items together, creating better versions and clearing up inventory space. All those chipped gems we've been hoarding so far, combined and upgraded. All those rejuvenation potions good for 1/3 of your fluids, combined into one for 100% of your fluids. Quest items? Completed. Want to visit the cows? That cost 1 leg. Any other obscure recipes available online? Done. The cube can do all of this, and greatly helps you throughout your quest. Secondly, the cube just acts as straight up free inventory space. No matter where you put it, it takes up 4 spaces. However, the cube itself has 12 spaces. This means that you basically just get 8 free spaces of inventory, which, as space gets more and more rare, this will be very handy. You can keep whatever you want in there. If you want some extra space in the stash to put more armor and stuff in, that's great, keep it in your stash. Or you could take it with you and do the same, and have the ability to transmute on the go. Just note that charms don't work from the cube, so if you want to use it for charms, I would advise against that. Also, The cube just looks cool and makes this sound effect. With the cube acquired, we now need to get some quest items to combine in said cubes, and in order to get into Tal Rasha's tomb. Now to do that, we'll need his staff, and in order to make the staff, we gotta go get a stick and a gem. And we need this so that we can go visit the man to go east, because apparently he's the guy responsible for holding up travel out of Luca Lane. Now the first item to be acquired will be the Horadric stick, which conveniently lies deep underground surrounded by literal thousands of giant man-eating bugs. Pretty cool stuff. Now the maggot lair is very interesting because it really does look and feel like it was made by a bunch of giant bugs. It's very gooey and claustrophobic. It's very confusing for your partner AI. And like all good bug lairs, this one has at least one queen, Cold Worm the Burrower, who does all of... not much. She just lets the beetle boys and the big orange ladies do all the work for her. Really, she's just kind of a stick in the mud. Anyways, let's just take out the horde and get the stick and go. Next, we need to get the top part of the staff, and that's acquired from the claw, but the sun just went out. Yeah, the sun just went out, and to know why, we gotta go talk to Drognin. Now, Drognin is the wise old guy who tells us that the snakes put the sun out, even though they're probably cold-blooded, which means they would need sun more than anyone, and that they'd probably freeze to death. But yeah, I guess they're not that bright.
This whole place is one big ale fog.
While we're here, Drognin basically tells us to do what we were going to do anyways, and get the amulet from the Claw Viper Temple. Before we head out though, we can browse his store, because this wise old man is also a salesman. That's right, Merchant Spotlight Part 2. Now, in Act 2, Drognin serves as the magic guy. This kind of merchant is the kind of guy who we buy spellcaster type items from, whether it's wands for a necromancer, or staves for a sorceress, or various other things like that. These are the kind of guys you go to if you want to buy equipment for your magic-based characters. If your sorceress or necromancer has a bit of change, I'd advise coming here every now and again should you want to explore every possible upgrade opportunity for your kit. While they don't sell yellow items, sometimes one blue trait is good enough. For example, I once bought a wand that does 3 to all necromancer skills. That's only one trait, but it's also pretty broken. While many of the items here may not seem too fancy, these especially, which give free skill points, are something which you should not necessarily overlook, especially if you've already invested in the skills that they give points in. And if you're thinking of getting new stuff, you might as well browse these kind of stores. The Magic Salesman, at least in this chapter, also tends to act as kind of a wise person. After all, it takes quite a big brain to use magic, and these NPCs are usually ones who think about the great mysteries of life, like where to get more Totinos at an affordable price. Anyways, having thought of Totinos and how much money it's going to cost to upgrade everything should I do it through the store, I think we better get back to questing. Now back to the grind, we're on our way to the Snake Temple, and along the way we find some of these blue monsters. Now, you've probably seen these before already in this playthrough footage. I do the audio first, so it might have been chopped together. But the blue monsters here, monsters with blue titles, are champions. And champions, of course, are just varieties of common monsters who have already beat the game. Now, champions come in quite a few varieties. There's the standard champion, which is just a stronger monster. There are possessed champions, which are immune to curses. There's spooky champions, which have high resistance to physical damage. And finally, there's berserk champions, who just deal and take more damage. Champions usually move in packs, and are markedly more threatening than their standard brethren. In fact, I would consider them more threatening than an isolated boss on occasion. They also tend to drop nicer stuff, though. And taking out champions is usually a great way of either grinding for cash, loot, or just plain experience points. With that diversion explored, let's get to the Snake Temple. And these snakes are quick. Best get to the bottom and get out. And this is pretty easy. While the Claw Vipers are, again, as mentioned, pretty quick, they're also pretty frail. And after breaking a few of them, we just gotta break their stuff and get the amulet as prescribed. Now with the amulet, we can combine it with the stick to get the Horadric Staff, which will continue to take up space in our inventory for the entirety of the act until we use it. Yeah, with the exception of the Horadric Cube, quest items in this game kind of suck. You need them to progress, obviously, as they literally break down walls in many cases, but they don't really do much other than take up space in the meantime. You can equip them if you really want to, but their stats tend to be relatively boring, and even if you did really like the stats on the item, they disappear after they're used for their assigned quest purposes. So, even if they were really good, there'd be no reason to use them. in the end, they just kind of serve as MacGuffins, which, I understand. You need a reason to go do stuff, and I understand that this was kind of a thing they had to do. And I do appreciate that the Horadric Staff is the largest quest item that you have to lug around for any amount of time, which is 4 inventory spots. Not horrible. Anyways, with the Horadric Staff equipped, and our journey in the desert having come to the conclusion, now all we gotta do is find Tal Rasha's tomb by reading Horizon's journal, and busting up Tal Rasha. Now, this entails a lovely frolic through a basement infested with evil, a second basement through a magic portal, an MC Escher painting, a chat with the Drip Lord, and then teleporting to a desolate canyon in the middle of nowhere surrounded on all sides by unscalable cliffs. Now, this is the Canyon of the Magi, and the final area, well, the next to final area if you count the tombs, of Act 2. There are 7 tombs, and you can explore all 7 if you want, which I kind of recommend for loot and EXP purposes, or if you want to get the story on, you can simply look at Horizon's journal and go to the tomb with the symbol prescribed. Each tomb is marked by a little marker at the front of it. Explore the prescribed tomb with the prescribed marker, and you'll find Tal Rasha's chamber soon enough. You just go to the prescribed temple, find this thing, put the Horadric Staff in the thing, and boom! New door. This is the last door of this act, and it will lead to the boss chamber, the boss of Act 2. But before we get there, let's just look at Morticia real quick. Now, again, as mentioned earlier, the Sorceress has some quirks. She is dependent almost entirely upon elemental damage, so it's very important for her to choose at least 2 elemental tabs, as to not get walled by resistant and immune monsters later on. In addition, her teleport makes her arguably the fastest character in the game, which is great because she's a glass cannon. It allows her to get behind enemies and kind of snipe, and, just kind of troll everyone. In line with the glass cannon part, she has great potential for big number, as a lot of her area spells also hit very hard. This is further enhanced by her unique items of the Eagle Orbs and Jarek Orbs, which often grants skill points in good skills available to the Sorceress. Many of them may also help with just straight flat damage or mana regain. Her primary stat, of course, is energy, because she's very mana dependent, and while there are some defensive and even melee Sorceress builds, I personally wouldn't do that, as I prefer the ranged glass cannon kind of play, and that the glass cannon is by nature very fragile. Let's hope that she isn't too fragile though, as we now enter the chamber of Duriel. Now Duriel is this swole bug man, and he's not messing around. They don't call him Lord of Pain for nothing, and he's super fast, all the while slowing you with cold auras, and he hits like a truck. He is, at least arguably, the hardest boss in the game, and probably undebatably the hardest boss in the game before a certain expansion set came along, but more on those bosses later. Oh, and also, Duriel's boss chamber is kind of unfair. It's the smallest in the game. Now, I've heard people say, and I've read online, that you can get into the other chamber if you need to escape him for a second. I don't know if it's my version of the game or something. I've never been able to do that. So I usually just end up running around in circles for my life while this giant bug man chases me. And that's usually how this fight goes. It usually devolves into running for your life in a circle while trying to chip away at him or having some helpers chip away at him. Chip away enough though, and the bug man will go down. Then you can enter the chamber in the back for reals and find an angel? Yeah, this is Duriel, and he's real pissed we took so long, as it seems we just missed the bad guys, and who happened to take the part of Tal Rasha that they used to hold the evil of Mephisto in a soulstone. He's probably also mad about being chained to the wall, but whatever. He should be happy that we came to bail him out. Anyways, he just kind of gets passive-aggressive and tells us to get off our ass and go east. So, let's go. And this brings us to Chapter 3, the Paladin. Peter the Paladin. Now, the Paladin makes sense as the pilot character of this chapter, as the plot of Chapter 3 talks about the corruption of the Zechariah Church, and so it's cool that Peter gets to take out the trash. The Paladin is a holy warrior, and one which relies on his physical strength and the power of faith. He's a pretty upstanding guy who, while slaying monsters, will also try to get you to come to sermon on Sunday. He will also help us get through the plot of Chapter 3, which boils down to protecting the dock site, reclaiming the holy city of Kurast from the corrupt Zechariah Church Council, and then using a magic mace infused with some guy's organs to smash an orb, so that we can get to the source of the corruption, Mephisto, brother of Diablo. Sounds pretty easy, right? We start our quest to Kurast, and upon walking out of town, we meet this totally not suspicious guy who isn't totally Diablo, just trolling us. Anyways, after fighting off some worms he spawns, we're basically told to just go find the city of Kurast and begin our trek through the jungle. Along the way, we of course encounter a bunch of monsters and a few unique monsters, yellow mini-bosses with unique traits, and the first one we encounter, or at least the first one you're supposed to encounter, drops a statue, which Deckard Cain tells us to give to Mashif the Boatman for another statue, which contained some dead guy's ashes, which we give to Alcor, who makes them into a potion that we drink to gain 20 life points. Thanks, I guess. From here, you can either talk to Cain, or if you go far enough in the jungle, a little button will pop up, and this will basically tell you that you gotta get Khalim's organs. Khalim was the one guy who Mephisto couldn't corrupt, and is the one guy that we can get to help us break the magical orb. So, we need to get his organs, his eye, heart, and brain, so that they can team up with his flail in order to smash the compelling orb and free the church, or something like that. It sounds about right. Go further into the jungle, we get a special protective knife for Ormus, quest number 2, and eventually we cut to the Spider's Cavern, where we find an eyeball. Now do note, since Peter has already completed these quests, whenever I come upon a quest item, I'll just put a little JPEG of the quest item in so you know what you're looking for. Anyways, eyeball, that's going right in the cube. Now we gotta get Khalim's brain, which is found in the Flail dungeon guarded by Witch Doctor MD, I presume, in Dugu. Is this offensive? Brain check. That's going right in the cube for later. And that's about all the essential quest items for this part of the act. That is the jungle parts and the jungle part adjacent dungeons. However, there's still plenty of exploring as we look for the Kurast itself, and a lot of the monsters in the jungle can be respawned, especially these little Flail guys who can be brought back by their shamans. This brings me to another point. That point being is that every world has a class of monsters which either revive smaller ones or spawn smaller ones. In World 3, again, it's the fetishes and their doctors. In Act 1, it's the fallen and their shamans. In Act 2, any mummies plus skeleton support. Act 4 has the vomiters, and Act 5 has a variety of reviving monsters. In any case, while these little guys are not so dangerous solo, they're almost never solo, and can create quite a dangerous living wall for their bosses, especially if the bosses keep reviving them. For this reason, I recommend that every character should have at least one corpse disposal skill. Now these skills are not marked and have nothing in common with each other than their shared utility of clearing the battlefield, but that one utility is very important to any character. And for this reason, I highly recommend every character have at least one corpse disposal skill. Now these disposal skills for the Barbarian are any of the fine potion or item skills. For the Sorceress, most cold spells will do. The Amazon has cold arrows. The Necromancer has corpse explosion and a litany of others. And the expansion Druid and his vines. And the Assassin has blades of ice. And the Paladin has redemption, which leads us to the Paladin skill tree. Now the transition here wasn't as clean as the other ones, as, quick note, unlike the other acts, Act 3 doesn't have a quest which grants you a skill point, so I had to get creative with the transition. Anyways, the Paladin skill tabs are defensive auras, offensive auras, and combat skills. Now all auras, offensive or defensive, serve as passive buffs that while taking up an attack slot, are just kinda left on in the background and affect all friendlies nearby and yourself. Defensive auras boost resource regain, defense, and resistances, and are generally centered around healing and staying alive. The last two, Salvation and Redemption, which serve to buff all resistances and serve to heal and dispose of corpses respectfully, are quite handy for 1 or 2 skill points. Although the rest of the auras on this tab kinda suck, honestly, as they don't necessarily scale that well with the difficulties that the Paladin will find later on. For more auras that don't necessarily suck though, we can look at the offensive aura tab, which do a variety of damaging dealing effects. Some of them buff hit chance or add additional damage, or reflect damage, or just hit enemies every now and again for different elemental damages. Thorns is a neat gimmick, although it doesn't scale well, but the final auras of fanaticism and conviction should be noted. The former basically allows your paladin to go berserk with no downsides, and the latter is one of only 2 skills in the game capable of breaking an elemental immunity. Powerful stuff. And this leads to combat skills, the great strike of the paladin. This tab includes Zeal, the bread and butter of many paladin builds, Holy Bolt, which, while it only damages undead, can also heal allies, and Vengeance, which can work around some of the elemental immunities seen throughout the game, and the shield skills, which easily allow for maxing out the block rate of your paladin, and even allows you to attack with your shield. With auras taking up 2 of 3 skill tabs, I think it's fair to say that while the paladin doesn't have the most attack options, he does have a deceptively large toolbox, and with his many combinations of different abilities, can easily get the job done. That job, of course, is the quests of Chapter 3, and you've probably noticed by now how by this point, Chapter 3 seems less organized than the first two, and that's because of the quest structure of this chapter, and the quest structure of the game as a whole. You see, while for this video I've been doing all the quests available, the majority of the quests, as mentioned before, can actually be skipped or ignored. I don't recommend this, of course, as most quests give good rewards, or are basically done along the way anyways. I did feel like I should point this out. I don't think it's a detriment. In fact, I kind of like it, as if there's a quest that for some reason you really hate, you can basically skip it with no real consequences. And it does feel more realistic, as if the world was really ending, I don't really know if I would put a high priority on obtaining a small knife in exchange for Ormus's valuable ring. I bring this up though because while most of the quests in Chapter 1 are kind of standalone, the quests in Chapter 2 and 3 kind of come along the way of the main quest. For example, in Act 2, you needed to clear Radament's lair and get to Tal Rasha, basically the main quests. However, the Tainted Sun is done along the way of getting the Horadric Staff, which is done along the way of getting the Tal Rasha, which also along the way completes the Arcane Sanctuary and the Summoner quests. While the 4 middle quests are standalone technically, they're kind of all done in order to get to the 6th and final quest completion. Same thing with Chapter 3. While the Gidbin quest is kind of, it's its own thing, it's done while exploring the jungle and is kind of along the way with getting to Kurast. In addition, the Golden Bird quest kind of just happens randomly and gives you a free 20 life points, and Lam Eason's Tomb, well, a cool quest, is one which could be totally skipped, or if you decide to do it, entails clearing out a small jungle to get a book in exchange for 5 stat points. It's a nice little quest, but again, it can be pretty easily skipped or done along the way. Back to the main quest, we finally found Kurast. And Kurast is divided into 3 areas: the lower area, the middle bazaar area, and the upper area. There are, of course, the Dungeness sewers and Travancore, which is just beyond city limits. And Kurast itself has, well, it's seen better days. The council really did a number on it, and we gotta get Khalim's heart, and then get out and see them. And this heart, of course, is located in the very clean and family-friendly sewers, located under the bazaar. Now, while the sewers are sprawling, there's luckily only 2 levels, with the lower one literally being 1 room, so getting Khalim's heart out isn't too daunting. Back on the surface now, it really is how odd and empty this town is, especially the bazaar. It feels like it could really use some merchants. Like, say, Alcor, the potion guy. That's right, Merchant Spotlight number 3. This time, we want to look at the potion guy. Yes, I know Alcor is also the gambling guy, but more on that mechanic later. Anyways, each act, except for Act 4, has a salesman who specializes in potions. They don't really sell too much, but sometimes all you need is a nice potion. And while normal healing and mana potions can be obtained from other places as well, the potions available here are much more diverse, usually also including antidote and stamina potions, which, although very niche, admittedly, do come in handy on that one occasion where for some reason you think you're going to need them. I have been there before. Potion salesmen generally don't sell much else, but you know what they say about finding your niche and then getting rich. In addition, the potion person, for some reason, usually tends to be the funniest guy around, and while some NPCs can come off as, well, NPCs, Lysander of World 2 and Alcor of Act 3 especially should be noted for their good comedic lines and deliveries. Lysander, he's just some old guy. I mean, he probably just wants to grill, let's be honest, and you know, his line about Horizon's urinal still lives in my brain rent-free. Alcor is another grumpy old man, and again, he made something out of a dead guy's ashes, so I gotta imagine he's a pretty cool, creative guy. And while potions merchants don't necessarily sell much, what they do sell is potions. And you know, those are pretty important for most of your playthroughs. In addition, simply stopping and listening to them is often worth it in and of its own. Anyways, back to the Kurast Bazaar after a quick trip to town. And with all of Khalim's organs now in the party, we gotta combine him with his flail in order to smash the evil orb and break into the Mephisto's lair. While we're here though, I'd like to point out how the whole Kurast area plus Travancore are probably one of the greatest areas to grind out loot. Since it's a town, there's tons of available chests and armor racks and other stuff, always willing to spawn gold and stuff for you. Now that we're at Travancore, we gotta take out the council holding the Flail of Khalim and guarding the compelling orb. Peter's gotta put that church under new management. And of course this requires disposing of old management. To do so, we clear the area of Travancore, and then face the Council. Now these guys are probably, I think, one of the coolest bosses in the game, because they're a group of slightly weaker bosses as opposed to just one jacked boss. And I think it's a really cool mechanic. They all kind of work together and have unique abilities and enchantments and attacks. It's kind of like the evil inverse to our party. Anyways, Peter gets to work, and the Council gets to dying. With the Council no more, having all 5 of them and their lesser Council members taken out, we obtain the Flail of Kaleem, I believe it's Kaleem's will, and we combine it with his organs to transmute them into the greatest mace of all time, made of a mace and some guy's squishy bits. Now wielding it, we hit the orb and break it into 1,000,000 pieces and a giant red fart cloud. With the orb destroyed, it's now time to see the manager. Before we do though, however, I'd like to quickly explore some quirks of the Paladin. As mentioned earlier, the Paladin has a lot of passive skills, which don't really need more than 2 or 3 skill points in, with the possible exceptions of fanaticism or conviction, so he can easily choose 1 or 2 combat skills and then just run amok with them. Since he will often use boosted versions of standard melee strikes, he may also be a little dependent on what weapon is equipped, although this isn't something that necessarily hamstrings him. Since he will be often up close and personal, his primary stat is, I would say, dexterity, as he needs a good bit of it to both up the chance to hit and the chance to block with his shield. He's a very shield-centric character, I feel like I should also note, and this greatly complements his style, as it provides for damage reduction, and his unique shields often give basically free resistances, sometimes even skill points in helpful auras or skills. Of all the characters in the game, the Paladin feels like the one which is the most defensive-oriented, and the one best equipped to resist the elements. He can easily, with the right equips, max out or near max out most of his resistances even in higher difficulties, and is one of the only characters which can deal holy damage, which, although it only damages undead, also has a unique quirk of healing ally. This is another weird quirk of the Paladin, which just adds a lot of flavor to him. This combined with the fact that he's more of a defensive tank as opposed to, say, an offensive tank like the Barbarian, make the Paladin just an all-around unique character. He's very cool, and even if he only has 1 tab of actual, quote, skills, he still feels like a very unique guy with enough skills to get the job done. Very cool dude. And it's this cool dude which will hopefully end Mephisto. Upon entering Mephisto's very messy lair, we gotta of course get to him, which of course involves crawling through a dungeon and hopefully not getting stabbed to death or exploded by these little skeleton guys who, they move a little fast for the processor and honestly can lead to a lot of the BS deaths I mentioned earlier. We eventually get to Mephisto, and by the way, his lair is just full of gold, and we set up an emergency portal, something you should do before every boss, and then clear out the last of his entourage. Finally, with the last of his entourage and the Council swept aside, we can get to Mephisto himself, the first of the 3 prime evils, a big bad, half a skeleton and a lot of energy, and he is, to be honest, after Duriel, kind of a letdown. His gimmick is he's the lightning guy, and, as mentioned earlier, lightning either deals a ton of damage or no damage, although his lightning attacks tend to be quite devastating. However, they're also ranged attacks, so if you get in real close and personal, as you can with the Paladin, you can also kind of just gimmick the AI into poisoning you and then slowly slapping you. As these are not his strongest attacks, it means you're pretty good as long as your resistances are decent, and as a Paladin they very much should be, and the fight isn't that bad at all. You can kind of just hug him to death, really. We finish the slap fight and collect our reward, and this enters up the red zone and the red portal to the next act, which will take place in the realm of Pandemonium. Now, with the entirety of a new act coming along the way, also comes a new hero, the Amazon, Lily. Now, the Amazon is cool because she's a mostly ranged fighter which uses physical ranged attacks, like bows and javelins, as opposed to magical ones. Now, many of her skills add magic strength to her attacks, but they still have their physical core to them, making them quite unique. Her main tools of the trade are the javelin, the spear, the bow, and the arrow. And it is with these she shall seek to complete the objective of killing Diablo. And that's basically the plot of Act 4 as well. Go kill Diablo. Now Act 4 is noticeably truncated, as it was originally the final chapter of the game, and for this reason only has 3 quests. The first one sees you eliminate one of Tyrion's old lackeys that sold him out. The second sees you take a hammer to Mephisto's soulstone, which, oh yeah, by the way, he dropped and contains the entirety of his immortal essence. And the third one sees you go get Diablo himself. All of this is done from the lonely Pandemonium Fortress, which holds only Halbu and Jamila, in addition to your party, which of Mr. Cain, and I guess Duriel by this point. Now to start, we just go down these long flight of stairs into the gray plains of something or other. Act 4 starts off as a very gray world, we'll see. And we gotta go find Iswal, the guy who sold Duriel out oh so long ago. Now he's just a sad boy wandering the plains of despair, and he seems pretty eager to fight us once we find him. He goes down pretty easily though, and as a result, we get 2 free skill points. Probably to make up from the one we didn't get up from Act 3. Now these skill points, of course, will go into the Amazon skill tree, which is quite a cool tree. Now, the Amazon skill tree has 3 tabs, like every other skill tree, and those tabs are that of Javelin and Spear skills, Passive and Magic skills, and Bow and Arrow skills. Now, the Javelin and Spear skills make the physical attacks from these weapons both much more effective, and can either imbue them with poison or lightning damage, or can just increase brute attack force and speed. Impale and Fend are especially notable, because if you're not throwing a spear, these can make for very large amounts of damage done very quickly. In addition, the ability to throw a javelin means that it can become a deadly ranged projectile of either lightning or poison. Very cool skills. Next is the Passive and Magic tab, which is personally my favorite. This tab gives a bunch of miscellaneous but very helpful skills and boosts. Some of these are passive skills to enable automatic dodging. Some allow you to see stuff you normally wouldn't be able to see. Some allow you to dodge missiles. Some allow you to slow missiles. And the final and strongest one is the one which lets you straight up summon a Valkyrie. Now this is a summonable follower, which is just, a big buff Valkyrie who goes out, gives and takes a bunch of damage. She can be a lifesaver, and can absorb a ton of damage that you otherwise would have to deal with. This skill tab as a whole is pretty neat, because almost everything here is unique, yet somehow synergizes very well with both each other and the Amazon build, and strengthens her greatly. In addition, since many of these skills are passive, you can just dump a skill point here or there, and just forget about it, all the while experiencing some nice benefits. The last skill tab are the bow and arrow skills, and these skills can either add fire, cold, or other unique effects to your arrows. Cold and fire damage is nice and, relatively self-explanatory. Cold arrows have the added effect of serving as corpse disposal, but I'd like to take a second to explore the unique effects. Magic arrow requires no arrows. Homing arrow can find all targets, and multi-shot and strafe are great for thinning out hordes of bad guys. All in all, while the Amazon skill tree is kind of simple for what it is, it's simultaneously very eclectic and yet very useful. Most of the skills here seem genuinely useful, or at least leave the useful stuff, or have niche applications. The passive skills ensure that whether you use a bow or spear though, you can still be quite powerful, and summoning a Valkyrie just helps you out a ton overall. Overall, the Amazon seems very well rounded to me, and is one of the few characters with opportunities to deal all 4 types of elemental damage consistently. Overall, she's just very well rounded, and this well-rounded skill set is going to help us greatly on our quest. As from now, the Great Plains have turned into a sort of fire river, and this fire river is the scene of the next quest, where after going along far enough, we get to the Hellforge, home of your boy Mephisto, and his magical hammer. Now this of course is going to be the hammer that we need to smash Mephisto's soulstone, which means we're going to have to borrow it from Mephisto, and you know where this is going. Anyways, we get this quest item for all of 2 seconds, which we just used to beat up a rock, and boom! Mephisto is gone. For now. This also has the added benefit of spawning a ton of gems. But what do gems do? Well, gems, including skulls, can be upgraded up to perfect status, and that any status can be inserted in the sockets in items to give some nice benefits. Now these benefits depend on the gem being used and what kind of equipment it's being inserted to, be it helmet, weapon, shield, or armor. Jewels usually do the same thing, but cannot be upgraded, so they're objectively worse most of the time, although they do have their niches, and some rare ones are very nice. Anyways, since some items can have up to 6 sockets, gems have the potential to turn a single piece of equipment with a few holes into it into a true treasure capable of wiping the floor with even the strongest of enemies. Runes are similar, although they have a few more quirks and will be discussed more later. That Hellforge trip, though, was quite damaging to our health, though, and we should get some healing. We can do this by going to town and talking to the healer. Yes, before we get to Diablo, we gotta get to Merchant Spotlight. Now, every town has a healer, and this is someone which you, upon talking to, will automatically heal you completely for free. The healer is not an isolated role, it should be noted. In Act 1, the healer, Akara, acts as kind of the magic dealer. Ormus is the healer in Act 3, who also is just another salesman. Chapter 2's healer, Farah, is the blacksmith, and Chapter 4's Jamila also serves as the gambling merchant. Truly a multi-talented person. Anyways, the healer, no matter what their other role is a great town person to talk to, as they heal you for free. It's always great to quickly top off your stats when you're in town, as you don't have to use any potions to do so, and it ensures that you're much less likely to die should you go back out in the wilderness. While they can't save your life, as you cannot die in town, they certainly make it a lot easier, and the healer should always be consulted whenever you're in town, if for no other reason than simply saving you some quick potion uses. On the topic of being quick, Chapter 4 tends to go by quite quickly, again since there's only 3 quests. We're back on track to complete this chapter, and about to get Diablo. As customary, let's go over some quirks of this character. Now the Amazon is a very well-rounded character as mentioned earlier. She has plenty of good skills for both ranged and melee combat, and great passive skills to back these up. She can summon help, and her unique spears and bows assure she's always a dangerous opponent. Her primary stat of course is dexterity, to ensure hits and item usage, though she isn't really locked into any one playstyle. While she isn't as tanky as the Paladin or Barbarian, she's definitely more so than the Sorceress or Necromancer, all the while having an almost parity in terms of range versatility and damage. All in all, she's very well rounded, and her unique skill set, as well as the unique ability to do strong damage in all 4 elements, make her a true threat. Now, let's end this quest. First, we gotta get into Diablo's lair, which consists of talking and walking past this very helpful NPC, and walking across a lava river. Next, we gotta touch 5 seals and go beat up the elite goon force sealed behind them. Finally, with all of this accomplished, the big bad box man comes out himself. Now, Diablo's element is fire, and with it, he can do a massive amount of damage, especially if you get hit too much. To help him hit you, he'll also try to trap you in some bone cages, which in later difficulties can be quite strong, so it's always a good idea to keep moving when fighting him. Hit him enough though, and with high enough fire resistances and perseverance, you will succeed, although it may take a while as he's also a very beefy boy, especially on higher difficulties. Once he is gone though, he'll drop some really cool stuff, and Duriel will give you the opportunity to go to World 5 if you have the Lord of Destruction expansion set. If you don't, you better hurry, because you only have 60 seconds to pick up all the loot before the game resets. Yes, this is real. I, for one, am not constrained for this timer though, as I have been blessed with an expansion of the game, which includes Act 5. Now, with Diablo's stuff relieved from him, it's time to go to this Act 5, and with this final act, we're going to go with the final member of the original cast, and that is the Necromancer. Now, I saved the Necromancer for last because he's my personal favorite, and honestly, he seems the most powerful of the original cast. In fact, all the cast. This is because he has the power to summon friends. That's right. While the Amazon could get a Valkyrie, a Druid some dog or a bear or something, and everyone of course can get a partner, the Necromancer alone has the power to summon the Goon Squad, the boys, a true hunting party, and we'll explore more on that later. Just know for now that Rick here is out to maintain the balance of good and evil, and right now that requires disposing of some excess evil. And there's lots of excess evil in the mountains of Horadric, a barbarian town which will be the base of operations for this act. Our objectives here are to help the city survive, rescue some friends, solve some intrigues, and then track down the last prime evil, Baal. Now, we all have to do this before Baal breaks the World Stone, a super powerful mystical element that does, something. They don't really explain, honestly. Anyways, this doesn't sound hard, so let's get going. Act 5 is pretty cool, because while it does have a very unique feel to itself, sometimes they'll also bring back some old enemies, for memory's sake. Let's go. Quest 1 sees us end the siege of the city, which involves climbing up a mountain a ways, taking out Shank the Overseer, along the way tearing through some of his thugs, and even helping out some friendly barbarians. A little higher up, we oversee Shank's dismissal. With Quest 1 complete, as a reward, Lorzek will socket an appropriate item for us. That's the Blacksmith of this town. The customary skill point quest is number 5 in this act, although since I'm running out of transitions, you know where this is going. While the Necromancer skill tree does not have the most overall useful skills, there are a few stinkers here. The good skills it does have can be straight up broken. I'm looking at you, Summoning tab. The tabs on this tree are Summoning, Poison and Bone skills, and Curses. Now since Summoning is quite broken, we'll save that one for last. This means that we'll start by looking at the Poison and Bone tab. Now this tab has a line of poison abilities on the left, some great attack abilities in the middle, and some miscellaneous skills on the right. The poison skills are a bit niche, although they can be quite powerful if fully spec'd into, though I don't know if 20 points in Poison Dagger is the biggest brain play, to be honest. In the middle are the Bone Attacks and Corpse Explosion. Now while Teeth is kind of a throwaway beginner skill, Corpse Explosion and Bone Spear are some of the best moves available to the Necromancer. Bone Spear is a big piercing spear of bone, exactly what it says on the box, and can deal a ton of damage to multiple enemies with one cast. It's a real staple, and can serve as your primary attack. Corpse Explosion, on the other hand, is one of the most efficient corpse disposal moves in the game, and is especially effective in crowd control roles. This is because, as soon as the first enemy goes down, you can blow them up and do a ton of damage to all the enemies around them, which will soon fall and speed up the process. With these skills and later summoning skills, the Necromancer is very adept at crowd control, believe it or not, and can often take out swarms of enemies by himself, although again his summoned goon squad does come in quite handy. Finally, the skills on the right side of this tab include Bone Armor, a neat novelty, and Bone Wall/Prison, which allow you to block and hem enemies in. While I don't find them too useful personally, they are neat and do have some niche applications. Then there, of course, is the Curses tab, which allows the Necromancer to hex his enemies from afar, which greatly weakens them and makes it in turn easier for either him or his partner or his summons to finish the job. Of note are the Curses Amplify Damage, Decrepify, and Lower Resistance, which vastly weaken enemies by doubling physical damage taken, cutting attack, defense, and speed by 50%, and lowering elemental resistances by up to 70% respectively. Lower resistances should also be noted as it's the other skill capable of breaking an immunity in the game. Confuse and Attract are neat crowd control options which can cause enemies to attack each other, and all curses in this game are in fact kind of broken because of how they work upon leveling up. You see, putting additional skill points in curses only increases duration and radius of curses. Now, while this sounds like a letdown, what this really means is that any level 1 curse that lands is just as effective as any level 20 curse that lands. This means that the curse tab skills are actually quite broken even from the very beginning, and that the neat crowd control, damage boosting, and other options available to the Necromancer can be quite powerful as soon as they're unlocked. This means that the curse tab is arguably one of the best bang for your buck skill tabs in the entire game. And if that didn't sound broken, well, let's look at the summoning tab. This tab is my personal favorite of all the tabs in our game, and sees our boy call upon the boys. Now, Summon Skeleton can summon, depending on your game version, 8 or up to 20 skeletons. And these skeletons aren't pushovers either. If enough points are put into Skeleton Mastery and Summon Skeleton itself, they can be tanks in their own right. This means that you can have your own army of bony boys ready to deal damage and take damage for you. Lots of guys are great if for no other reason than pinning down all the enemies that will come your way. To enhance your skeletal horde, you can also summon mages later on, which aren't too strong but a cool gimmick, up to 8 mages, and a golem. Now the clay golem is the cheapest and slows enemies down a good bit. He's a good beginner golem and a good quick recast when fighting a boss who will one-shot any golem anyways. The blood golem is neat because it can heal, although this is not always neat because if it takes too much damage, it can also harm you. It cannot kill you this way, but it can eat up a large portion of your HP pool. Next is the iron golem, which is very unique, in that it absorbs the properties of any metal equipment used to summon it, which is promptly destroyed. This golem is also unique in that it sticks around after exiting the game, because, well, the game developers wanted to be fair, because, if you used a rare item to make a super buff golem, it seems kind of mean to take that away from you just because you have to go to your work or something. Finally, there's the big, bad, and expensive fire golem, who, while statistically the beefiest, can also unfortunately be walled by any fire immunities. There's also Golem Mastery, which boosts all golem stats. And finally, there's the Revive skill, which lets you revive fallen enemies to fight for you. You can do up to 20 of these, although these skill points are not really worth it, as the skill is not really worth the hassle itself, to be honest. A batch of skeletons and a big beefier golem are more than enough to get the job done, especially when you consider the fact that revives don't stick around for too long and tend to wander off the screen and eliminate themselves from gameplay anyways. All these skills, though, create a strong caster, which can cast impactful spells into crowds of weakened enemies, while all the while having his mob of followers hold them back and attack as well. The Necromancer's skill tabs are all very synergetic, and when they synergize well, are very broken. And we're going to need all of this brokenness to continue our trek up the mountain, as we seek to rescue some friendly barbarians for man-at-arms Qualkek. I'd like to point out how Act 5 is structured around climbing the mountain. It's really cool, and it feels like everything changes as you get higher and higher, so it feels like you're progressing more and more as you continue. Anyways, our boys make quick work of Bale's boys, and Mr. Keck gives us some runes in return for rescuing his men. Now, runes are neat little rocks which act like gems, but are slightly different. Each rune has a unique effect, from the lowly L rune giving light radius, to the ultra-rare Zod rune making something indestructible, to the 20% deadly strike capability of the low rune. and a bunch of other cool effects per rune, like gems, whether you place them in a helm or shield or weapon, change what the rune does, and 3 runes can be upgraded into the next rune up. Although do note that after a point, doing so will also require some kind of gem to be used in the transmutation. The neatest part of runes, though, is the rune word mechanic. If certain runes are placed in a certain order, in the right kind of item, they can unlock a rune word. Runes can turn ordinarily ordinary socketed items into truly broken works of art. They also make this squishy sound when placed in an inventory spot. After getting Mr. Kek's rocks, Mala, the nice healer lady, asks us for some help. She says Nihlethek is up to no good and suspects he might have disappeared Anya, who was opposed to his plan of basically selling out to Baal. It turns out she was right, and after fighting Anya frozen in a river down here, Mala gives you a potion to help free her. Anya, of course, is eager to get back at Nihlethek, who did in fact sell out by giving Baal the item to skip the hardest boss in the game, and we gotta settle things. This requires taking a side trip to Nihlethek's crib, where we set things right and prove who the better necromancer is.
You were a sad little man, Nihlethek.
Now, quick mention upon Nihlethek's crib, the halls of anguish and Vought, and whatever it is. I looked up Vought. I don't think it's a real word. I just thought I would say that. I know it's an aircraft manufacturer from World War II, but I don't think it's an adjective, at least from what I could tell. I'd also like to point out that his lair is a nice departure from the mountainscapes and caves that we've been in so far. It feels like a real temple, but not the kind of temple you pray in, more like the temple you get sacrificed in. It's a cool little side quest, beat up some bad guys in a neat environment for some cool stuff, and they're quite expansive dungeons. On returning to town, Anya, happy to be free and seeing Nihlethek disposed of, gives us the ability to add our name to a single item of our choice. This is just a neat customization thing and doesn't really affect the gameplay or the properties of the item, but it is pretty cool. She also gives us the ability to gamble, which brings us to the final merchant spotlight of the series, the spotlight on the gambler. Now each town has a merchant which will allow you to gamble. What this entails is being presented a selection of unidentified items, each with a set price, which will be identified upon purchase. The pool resets upon exiting the screen should you not like what's available, and every item has at least one magical property. While most items bought this way are okay, some are straight garbage, but every now and again you will find a great item. And it is quite a fun mechanic to use all your extra gold, which by this point in the game is probably starting to pile up. Even if it is a bit expensive, are you really going to need all of it? Why not see what you can get and gamble responsibly? After all, what price can be put on a priceless artifact? For this reason, gambling in Diablo 2 is kind of a guilty pleasure of mine, as even though I stand by saying that the best kit can probably be found by just grinding it out, you'll never know what you're going to find until you play. And the gambler also serves as a kind of mischievous or snarky character. In Act 1, it's Geed, who says a lot of funny stuff. Act 2's Alzix has kind of a dry sense of humor too, because he lives in a desert. Alcor, as mentioned earlier, is funny. And Anya, in Act 5, is still getting over the whole frozen thing. The gambling mechanic in Diablo 2 is a neat feature that gives gold something else to do other than simply buy potions, buy some few items, and revive your fallen helpers. Now, after losing a big chunk of our savings, it's time to continue up the mountain and get to Baal, and the World Stone. And the climb itself isn't too bad. We just go through some frozen areas, some more frozen areas, fight some imp guys, and get along with things. The climb isn't too bad. But unfortunately, it ends with another boss. And this is the hardest boss in the game. Now, before the expansion, Duriel was arguably the hardest boss in the game due to his cold damage, his speed, his strength, and the confined quarters you fight him in. Though on reflection, I think that the title of hardest boss in the game should now be bestowed upon the boss currently being looked upon, and that is the Ancients. Now, the Ancients are 3 ancient barbarian heroes simply doing their job, keeping everyone out of the stone room. So, I have nothing against them personally, but boy are they brutal. One has a nasty axe projectile, one can cleave you in half with his bigger axe, and the final one can just helicopter you into another dimension, the dead one. Fighting these guys is made even harder by the fact that they're the only boss in the game which completely heals should you teleport to town. No other boss does this. Literally no other boss. If you need to repair your stuff mid-Duriel fight, you're good. Go back to town, come back. He may have healed a little, but he's still half dead. If you go change your gear when fighting Mephisto, damage again, still mostly there. If Andariel's giving you too much trouble and you need to buy some potions, she's still jacked up. You can still go back and basically continue where you left off. All is well. No other boss in the game, not even Bale, completely heals should you go back to town for any reason, as long as you come back within a reasonable amount of time. Even death doesn't affect this mechanic. If you die fighting, say, the Council, and then you come back, retrieve your body and stuff, and then go back to fighting the Council, their health bar is still going to be near where it was originally. They do not completely heal even upon your own death. The Ancients, I cannot stress this enough, are the only boss that heals completely whenever you go to town for any reason. This means that you have to do all three at once and one clean go, and can be an exercise in frustration that can boil down to dropping a ton of potions on the floor. You will exhaust whichever ones you have in your belt, and running away all the while trying to chip at them. Hopefully, one of them will glitch into a wall long enough for you to pick off his buddies, and in the meantime, you can rethink your life decisions. Facing these guys is a true challenge. Even with a full horde, the Necromancer can struggle against them. Somehow, though, we succeed and continue on to the Worldstone Keep. And, as this is the last dungeon in the game, I'd like to go over a few quirks of the Necromancer first. As mentioned before, I think the Necromancer is probably the most broken character in the game simply because he can call upon so much help and because he can drastically weaken his foes right off the bat, basically, with his great curses. Bone Spear is a great piercing spell and can do great damage regardless, and the character's frailty doesn't really matter too much if the enemy can't get to you in the first place because you have a big wall of minions in the way. No surprise, the Necromancer's main stat is energy, as he is a caster, and he goes through quite a bit of mana, although his unique preserved heads and wands can help him with this, or at least boost his skill tree and proficiencies. This character combines the boost of a paladin's aura with the numbers needed to make them truly devastating. In addition, he still manages to strike from a distance and support his troops. Ironically, though he seeks to maintain the balance of life and death, the Necromancer himself is not balanced at all, and he's truly broken in a truly fun way. Just remember, skeletons require one corpse per skeleton, so make sure you have some bodies around before you try to assemble the boys. It also means that fighting bosses can be a little difficult, and you may need to take a little break from some boss fights to go recreate the horde. Although this is a nitpick, and honestly, the Necromancer is still pretty broken and fun. And hopefully, this last boss will be fun too. Now, we're in the Worldstone Keep, and we gotta delve through a few levels of this very fancy hallway, take out some bad guys, and get to Bale. It's a long, not too hard fight with our boys, and we get to Bale, only for Bale to send out 5 last waves of bosses. And this is kinda cool because each boss represents a different act. The first 3 are not that hard, they are from the first 3 acts after all. Although the Pit Lords of World 4 and the Donkey Men of World 5 can be quite brutal, especially the Donkey Men, who are seen nowhere else in the game, and hit very, 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 very hard. Once Bale's entourage is cleared, it's time for the final boss. And that final boss is Bale. Now, Bale's kind of a weird boss. On one hand, he seems less intimidating than the Ancients, which not really saying much, honestly. And on normal difficulty and nightmare difficulty, I'd agree he's much easier than them. In Hell, though, well, just know that Hell is an accurate term for the difficulty involved. Bale can be extremely annoying as he uses both fire and cold spells, as he breaks the paradigm of each boss having a primary element. Although this does make sense because there's only 4 elements in the game and he's the final boss, but it also means that you can't just wall one element and be good. With, say, Diablo, if you could somehow get your fire resistance to 75 on a whim, he'd be a lot easier. If you could just wall poison when fighting Andariel, she'd be a lot easier. However, with Bale, you need to somehow both wall cold and fire at the same time. In addition, when you get up close, Bale can use his mana flame, which, although doing no damage, toasts your mana, which is a massive pain for spellcasters. He also summons these tentacle things to harass you and generally get in your way. Oh, and he also has a respawning clone with identical stats that can not be killed very easily and can do just as much damage. Yeah, that's pretty fun. Although it's okay, because the real Bale has a name which doesn't line up with his title, but the fake one does. This makes sense, as only the real Bale would be discordant enough to make sure even his name tag was wrong. Just focus on the real one though, and eventually you'll beat the game. And this brings us to some last minute loot, and the cutscene where Duriel just goes full Rick James and messes up that Worldstone. Once you get through the final portal, you see a nice little title screen where Deckard Cain congratulates you and gives you a cool new title. In order of difficulty, these are Slayer, Champion, and Patriarch/Matriarch. But even if the game is over, there's still a few things to touch on. Namely the expansion characters and a few other gimmicks I didn't find room to put in somewhere else. To start, there is the Druid, which is a furry barbarian. He has the skill tabs of elemental skills, shape-shifting skills, and summoning skills. The elemental skills are either cold or fire-based, or wind-based, which is just physical damage, And while they're neat, they face the issue of elemental resistances and cooldown times on the more powerful ones. The most powerful one, Armageddon, is even locked behind another level 30 skill, the only time this happens in the game, and to be fair, kind of sucks. Although I suppose this is an attempt to balance the fact that it can be used while transformed, which leads us to the Transformation tab. This tab sees our druid embrace his inner furry and transform into either a wolf or a bear. The former sees high speed and attack ratings, while the bear is a tanky, hard-hitting, lumbering beast. Both have unique attacks, and there's argument for either path, although do note you'll most likely have to choose one or the other during your druid run, as shapeshifting is, at least in my opinion, the most viable tab open to the druid. Finally, the druid can summon some helpful plants, animals, and spirits in the summoning tab. The plants are the vines, which serve as corpse disposal and can either do a little poison damage or heal your health or mana. The animals are either wolves or bears, good for some support damage and damage sponging. And the spirits are orbs, which greatly buff either overall attack or health. There's also one which does barbs, but that doesn't scale well, so we don't talk about it. The vines are cheap and helpful, and the animals can be expensive and helpful, and the spirits can be extremely helpful, if they don't die. You see, this is where everything kind of starts to fall apart for the druid. You see, the spirits are summons which essentially serve as auras, and they're very powerful ones at that. Heart of Oak can give you a ton of health, and Heart of Wolverine can make your attacks quite devastating. They're very, very helpful summons. However, they are summons, and this is where the problem comes in. You see, if spirits are summons, which essentially serve as auras, it means that they're auras that can die. While it does free up skill slots to use for other attacks, it makes them mortal. And if their mortality should happen to be ended by, say, an enemy taking advantage of AI too dumb to walk away from the fray, well, you just lost a massive boost that you were probably banking on. Meaning you can randomly die because the AI, for a defenseless spirit, wasn't smart enough to see the spirit leave the dangerous horde of enemies. It's a textbook cool idea, which falls a bit flat in execution. And I feel this is kind of a good summary for the druid as a whole. Although I've beaten hell difficulty with the druid, I must say that past some point in Act 1 I didn't have much fun with it. This character seems like a cool attempt to combine the drastically different classes of Barbarian, Necromancer, and Sorceress, but in this regard is weaker than all of them. Like the Barbarian, he can be kind of a melee brute, although this is dependent on putting skills in shapeshifting, which admittedly is a pretty effective skill in my experiences, and depending upon very frail spirits, which in my experiences is not a very effective aspect of the summoning tree. Like the Necromancer, he can get a good amount of summons, max bodies 12 if you go for 5 basic wolves, 1 vine, 1 spirit, and 5 ravens, though do note the ravens don't take damage or distract enemies, so I don't know whether the count those as summons or passive damage, but the summons themselves are simply more lackluster than what is available to the Necromancer. This is compounded by the lack of a mastery skill to buff all summons, meaning that while the Necromancer can just put 40 skills in the Summon Skeleton and Skeleton Mastery, the Druid simply doesn't have that option available. Finally, like the Sorceress, the Druid can cast some elemental spells, but most of them just feel kind of half-baked, and can't even be used if you're shapeshifted, which greatly reduces their overall applicability. Sorry to any Druid fans in the audience, but I personally just don't like this guy as Kid. Again, it's really cool, but it just doesn't synergize that well, and this lack of synergy can really bring the Druid down. As for the Assassin, I admittedly have the least amount of experience with this class, although I will attempt to explain it the best I can and say from what I've experienced, it's quite cool. The Assassin's unique skills are martial arts, shadow disciplines, and traps. Martial arts serve as a set of main blows and finishing blows, which, when used in combination, can greatly strengthen each other and make close-up melee combat a fun option for certain assassin builds. While they're not the flashiest or fanciest moves, they can be quite effective and definitely deal the pain. Next up is the Shadow Discipline tab, and like the Amazon's Magics tabs, is a set of eclectic but very useful skills. It's kind of a utility tab. These skills can do many things, like buff the assassin's unique claw weapons, allow claw weapons to serve as a kind of shield, add poison damage to attacks, limited projectile attacks, and even summon a speed clone for help. Many of these skills are very helpful, and I just love the idea of an eclectic utility tab. Finally, there's the Traps tab, and this is probably the Assassin's most unique skill set. This tab sees the player construct and place any variety of unique and fantastic traps to decimate enemies. While some are pretty simple, as the tree progresses, it can construct some true monstrosities, and it's an interesting, or possibly annoying experience to try and get enemies to walk in the traps. Overall, where the Druid felt like a unique combination of previous characters, the Assassin feels more like an original concept, She can be heavily melee based with her martial arts, though also has a sort of utility tab, kind of like the Amazon, and her completely unique trap tab allows her to involve herself in strategic placement and enemy baiting. Overall, it feels very unique and cool, and I like the idea of a character's strength lying in craft, as opposed to either fantastic levels of strength or magic. Another little bullet point I'd like to talk about quickly is difficulty spikes. Although there's only 3 difficulties in Diablo 2, the gaps between each can be very widely felt. Normal difficulty is pretty easy actually, and most if any deaths in this difficulty will probably just be the result of cheap gimmick kills or W2F moments, as the game is prone to have every now and again. This difficulty is pretty easy most of the time, and great for getting the feel of your character and getting the level 30 to unlock all your skills. Next comes Nightmare difficulty, which I feel is the ideal Diablo 2 difficulty. This difficulty sees much stronger enemies and lets you know what skills scaled well and which didn't, so you can retool for harder challenges. It should also be noted that every time you up the difficulty, you lose some resistances, so be aware that you're going to feel those elemental attacks more than ever when you start your next difficulty playthrough. Overall though, Nightmare difficulty isn't too bad, and as long as you don't do anything crazy, like rushing literally everything, or stupid, like putting 20 skill points into max stamina, you shouldn't have a bad time. You might have a few frustrating oopsies or moments, but it's pretty fun overall. The enemies are strong enough to be engaging, but not broken enough to be annoying, and the loot's pretty nice too. Finally, there's the Hell difficulty, which is appropriately named. To start, every enemy is given a massive increase in health and damage, but what really breaks them is that every single enemy is given at least one elemental immunity, meaning you better have put your damage dealing eggs in more than one elemental basket. Compounding this is the fact that death now removes 10% of experience currently on the player. While 7.5% can be recovered, multiple deaths will still add up. And while player experience loss upon death was a thing in Nightmare difficulty as well, it wasn't as big of an issue since death was more rare and the loss wasn't so big. In Hell though, it can make even leveling up a challenge at times. And this difficulty is also really efficient at killing partners, meaning that even golds can be taxed if you keep reviving your partner or need to spam potions, which again you might chug from time to time in Hell. Beating Hell though is a very challenging, and sometimes frustrating act though, which I find to be pretty cool though, as you do get your cool new title, and it is a pretty good show of either ability or determination. Doug here, for example, died 30 plus times to get his title, and while it did take an hour of throwing his corpse against Bale, well, gosh darn it, he got it done. The point is that while Hell difficulty isn't always fun, that's kind of the point. So I think it's just a unique little artifact of difficulty from earlier game design, and I do think it's pretty cool. Something that I never really thought was cool, or to be honest I never really got into, was the hardcore setting. Now, death is not always an option in Diablo 2, and if one wants a more realistic game, they can opt for a hardcore character. This kind of character plays the exact same, except for the crucial difference that they only get to die once. Well, technically, they don't get to die at all, but they can die once. They get a different title for each difficulty beating of the game, and they have permadeath. I, especially knowing how random death in this game can feel sometimes, I'm not a personal fan of this, as I don't want all of my playthrough being lost because some guy that I couldn't see exploded, and, critical hit, and now I'm dead. Though if you do want to experience a new intense form of gameplay, this might be the one for you. Another little thing that I thought I should mention real quick is traps. Non-assassin traps. Sometimes you'll open a chest or something and you hear a little creaking sound like grrr, and this will indicate a trap. Now, this means that the chest or whatever will unlaunch an attack on you, and that you should get out of the way. Once the attack is released, you can go in, get your stuff, get out. Didn't think of anywhere else to mention this, so I thought I would. Although on the topics of chest, they can sometimes be locked, so always keep a key on your person. Although the assassin does not need keys. Finally, to end on a more fun note, I'd also like to speak of the Cow level. Now this is a bonus level which you can reach by combining a Tome of Town Portal and Wart's Leg in the Horadric Cube. In this level, you can fight hordes of pre-hamburger in order to collect a ton of gold and cool stuff. It's one of the most famous and memed hidden levels in all of gaming, and it really is pretty cool. In conclusion, having just talked about this game ad nauseum, is Diablo 2 the best RPG ever made? I would say, that depends on your preferences, honestly. You should probably put some thought into, your own preferences and feelings and what you prioritize in a game. But for me, I think it is. Now, there's everything needed for a good RPG and more, even if the packaging is a bit dated. Sure, the controls can be a bit clunky, and there's some weird RPG quirks, and weird deaths, and sometimes, you glitch into a wall, but sometimes, the enemy glitches in the wall, and it is a bit simple at times. But it is also very creative and, importantly, fun. There's plenty of variety here, and even if the game lacks some quality of life additions modern games have, I'm looking at being unable to transfer items between characters. I know you can technically do this, but it's a complicated process. The game itself is still very fun. You go out, you get loot, you get stuff, you get the quest done. The quest can be repeated for more fun times. It's a lot of fun just going out and, doing stuff. Well, I do like Diablo 3, after they cleaned it up. Diablo 2 is the first video game I personally remember playing. Not the best parenting decision, but the coolest. Thanks, Dad. And, I will admit I'm probably very biased here. That aside, I feel there's still great reason to say that it's an objectively amazing game. Its simplicity, combined with its variety, create a game experience which is very accessible, and yet can be very deep. It's very easy to get into, and can yet manage to be enthralling even after hundreds of hours of gameplay. Its variety of classes, and options, and loot mean that the same linear gameplay can always feel different, and even play different depending on how you want to play your character. It's a very good exercise in simplicity, and I think that's actually why it's very, very strong. In an age of better graphics and processing and complications and more stuff and over-tutorializing and everything having minute details and whatever, Diablo 2 at its core is still very, very fun and very simple. Now, I know there's a ton of nuance in it. There's the rune word mechanics, there's rare hidden items you can find, there's different synergies with different magical items, there's limited amounts of magic attuning. I know there's a ton of unique small mechanics in Diablo 2. However, all these mechanics simply serve to flesh over a very simple core. And I feel the combination of a very simple core mechanic with a very deep level of depth available in said core mechanic combine to make a great gaming experience. It's just simple, pure fun to just go around and beat stuff up and, get stuff and talk to Cain and stay a while and listen.